from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
By the onset of the 1950s, with the Korean War in full swing and the Berlin Blockade Crisis in recent memory, it was made clear to the Truman administration that the two global superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union, would be embroiled in conflict for decades to come. At a foreign policy luncheon, President Harry Truman stated, "The cause of freedom is being challenged throughout the world today by the forces of imperialistic communism. This is a struggle, above all else, for the minds of men. Propaganda is one of the most powerful weapons the communists have in this struggle. This propaganda can be overcome by the truth, plain, simple, unvarnished truth." The long-term legitimacy of the Soviet Union and its satellite states relied on their unchallenged control over information and ideas. Under the Truman administration, US-funded radio stations began broadcasting across the Iron Curtain. Among them were Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and Radio in the American sector. The American radio stations had similar goals. They aimed to sustain the morale and confidence of their audience and ideologically push them away from communism by using uncensored reporting. By communicating to people ideas and news in opposition to their communist government, they provided a line of thought independent to the regimes which dominated their land. Rather than inciting rebellion directly, these radio stations engaged the state media in a war of ideas, challenging the legitimacy of the puppet regimes. They broadcasted music programs and other forms of entertainment relevant to a specific country's culture. This was done to give citizens motivation to listen to American radio stations, especially in comparison to the propaganda-filled state media. These organizations had dedicated audience research departments and operated in a decentralized manner, having units for each country. Decentralization and quality audience research were important if American broadcasts were to compete with local radio stations. This way, they could more closely associate their content with what a specific audience wanted and understand listenership rates. It was not uncommon to hear the pronouns we and us on Radio Free Europe broadcasts. Audience research was done by surveying citizens under communist regimes while they were traveling abroad and processing that data to estimate listening rates. Audience research surveys indicate that people listen to Western radio more as a source of information during times of crisis. Listening levels were higher in countries closer to the West. In Hungary, listening rates were the highest, with almost 50% of the adult population listening to Radio Free Europe every week throughout the 60s. Romania had similar rates of listening due to a more repressive government and higher levels of distrust. Listening rates in Poland and Czechoslovakia averaged 40 and 30% respectively. This audience research shows us how far-reaching American radio broadcasts were, but not the impact they had on events in the Cold War. These broadcasts, by design, have not had direct short-term impact. During the East German uprising of 1953, Radio in the American Sector, or RIAS, openly broadcast news of the demonstrations, which helped accelerate the spread of the uprising. The RIAS enjoyed high listenership rates and trust to such an extent that Radio Berlin had to try and publicly discredit them when they tried to report on mass emigration from East Germany. This was an example of how American radio stations could influence events as they unfolded indirectly. After Premier Nikita Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956 condemning Stalin and his totalitarian crimes, Radio Free Europe spread word fast, Soviet censorship notwithstanding. Eastern Europe was hit with a new wave of liberalization seemingly overnight. The news of the secret speech emboldened demonstrations in Poznan, Poland. Liberal reforms were forced upon the communist government in Warsaw. Subsequently, activists in Hungary began mass demonstrations, which turned into a full-on revolution. Broadcasters in the Hungary unit of Radio Free Europe went as far as to air tactical advice to the revolutionaries and made false implications implications about Western intervention. This violation of RFE's policy against inciting revolt hurt the credibility of Radio Free Europe and showed one of the weaknesses of decentralized broadcasting organizations. The speed and intensity of the liberalization movements in the Soviet satellite states displayed the effectiveness of American broadcasting. The opposition was given a voice, and it was clear that opinions unfavorable towards the puppet regimes were taking root in the Soviet bloc. This mass psychological impact, however, is an inference. The widespread reach of Western radio has already been established. To understand and interpret long-term influence and impact of Western broadcasts, we need to use empirical data. The Soviet government and its satellite states recognized and resisted the influence of Western broadcasts by all means available to them. The primary method they used to prevent listeners from hearing American broadcasts was called jamming, in which they output a noise on the same frequency as the Americans were broadcasting to prevent potential listeners from hearing the broadcasts. Jamming efforts were intermittent, and the intensity differed by radio station. Whether or not American stations were being jammed was taken as an indicator of their perceived effectiveness or of relations between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet bloc frequently tried to discredit Western propaganda stations in their broadcasts and write them off as Western agents. Audience surveys indicate that people were not convinced by this. In fact, RFE surveys showed that those who listened to Western radio were 61% less likely to believe Soviet state media. This credibility was established largely because the American radio stations did not need to wait to report stories. The Soviet state media refrained from reporting large stories, such as the 1983 Korean airline incident, until days after the Western radio had, which fostered distrust between the people and the state media. This distrust was emphasized by a 1986 survey in which the most popular first source of information for the Chernobyl disaster in the Soviet Union was Western radio. The state media failed to report on the incident for 2 days, and then for weeks gave scant details. In contrast, Western radio stations were the only place to find information on health precautions and up-to-date news. Citizens who listened to and disseminated information from Western broadcasts were also punished in the Soviet bloc, but punishments were not widespread. Most listeners were either warned or put on a list. The Soviet satellites were also involved in a number of intelligence operations against Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which merged in 1976. Agents would infiltrate their ranks and in some cases even attempt to assassinate broadcasters. The East German Stasi even went as far as to bomb their Munich headquarters in 1981. The scale and intensity of pushback against Western radio demonstrates the perceived impact and threat of these broadcasts from the East European perspective. Western radio broadcasts did not only reach common citizens, but also managed to inspire dissidents. Václav Havel, a former Czech dissident and eventual president of Czechoslovakia, testified to the important role Radio Free Europe played in the democratization of Czechoslovakia.
Do světa. Já se domnívám, že ten vliv a význam byl veliký, byl hluboký a myslím si, že jsem jeden z těch, kteří by o tom mohli dost svědčit, neboť jsem dlouhá léta.
The testimony of an anti-communist dissident solidifies the influence of Western broadcasts in communicating new ideas to people across the Iron Curtain. He went on to say that Western radio played a role in both affirming the beliefs of dissidents and giving common citizens a new perspective on events. In conclusion, American radio stations were successful in using local culture and entertainment to attract listeners. These stations had a short-term impact focused around Khrushchev's secret speech and the quick spread of liberalization movements in Eastern Europe. The American radio stations made a long-term impact by communicating credible news and different ideas to their target audiences, ultimately accelerating the demise of communism as an idea and the collapse of communist regimes. Western radio in the Cold War showed how effective mass media is as a tool of political warfare. Its success underscored the importance of knowing an audience well during an effective mass media campaign, a lesson reflected in contemporary political and commercial campaigns.